The Fawcett Center Restoration is an urban restoration effort along the western bank of the Olentangy River. It is a disturbed riparian forest. A newly formed OSU chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration, SER, has chosen this patch of land to enhance and restore. SER is an organization that focuses on conservation efforts, restoring biodiversity, and creating more resilient ecosystems for changing climates. SER started out as a graduate club and recently started welcoming undergraduates as a way to get more people involved with restoration efforts. They also do community outreach by partnering with FLOW, Friends of the Olentangy Watershed, at some of their events. We spoke with John Ballas, chairman of the Restoration Committee of the OSU chapter, to gain some more insight on the project.
But we ended up deciding on the Fawcett Center because it is, one, really close to campus, and it'd be really easy to get people who don't have cars out there. Two, it's this really disturbed riparian forest, and there'd be a lot for us to do in terms of if we wanted to remove honeysuckle or do herbaceous control on things like teasel. So we had a lot of options for the site. And other than that too, we also knew a few people who were in charge of that plot of land, and having it on OSU property kind of made a few logistic things that aren't as exciting a lot easier.
The most obvious challenge to restoration on the site was the dominance of invasive species such as honeysuckle and Callery pear. Interestingly, a clear boundary was seen between areas of good soil, which grew honeysuckle, and areas with poor soil, which grew Callery pear.
We had a ton of honeysuckle, basically nothing growing underneath. It was pretty well established, and that was growing in our areas that had better soil. But there was also this other section of the site that didn't really fit into that had a whole bunch of really shallow soil. But for whatever reason, Callery pear, or Bradford pear, did really well there. So we kind of had these two separate and distinct areas, each with their own invasive that required different conditions to thrive in. But it was really bizarre. You'd get this clear line where all of your Callery pear was growing, and pretty much nothing else but Callery pear was growing, and then there was a really clear border in the soil where you could actually, we had a few people out digging soil and taking a few cores, and there was a really clear distinction in the soil, and then after that, basically, honeysuckle was the only thing growing. I figured that Callery pear would be able to grow in that honeysuckle area, but maybe in that good soil, honeysuckle would be able to do a lot better than the Callery pear.
The invasive plants would outcompete any native plant on the site. Before any planting of native vegetation could be done, the invasives had to be removed. The first invasive removal was done in February of 2019. On November 2nd, SER hosted an invasives removal workday. Honeysuckle and Callery pear were cut down as close to the ground as possible. Invasive shrubs were cut, and the stumps that remained were painted with herbicide. The brand of herbicide used was Aquanite, a variety of glyphosate that is safe for use near water. However, during the removal, it could be noticed that plants that had previously been cut ended up resprouting around the area of the original cut, showing that the site will always need invasive monitoring.
One slightly controversial aspect of the restoration was the decision to leave brush piles of the removed invasives at the site. Key stakeholders thought that leaving piles of brush on the site would look unattractive and should not be in a heavily trafficked area where people would often visit. SER argued that the brush piles provided habitat and left a legacy of forest structure to alleviate the effects of tearing out the invasives that dominated the site previously.
Some of the grounds people wanted us to, if we did keep these brush piles, make sure that they were all condensed, because people are going to be seeing this site, and this isn't just some remote forest in the middle of nowhere. But Don specifically and myself were both very pro brush pile. Coming from an area researching solitary bees, honeysuckle hollows out really quickly and makes the perfect nesting habitat for a lot of solitary insects. And then we had other people who were coming from different fields and how brush piles, or thinking about how brush piles make really good nesting habitat for birds, and overall we decided to keep them there.
The concern over aesthetics and the use of the site highlights the importance of addressing stakeholder concerns and recognizing the different values that inform the actions that are taken during restoration.
After the invasives had been removed from the site, SER began outplanting native trees in early spring 2019. No specific reference sites were used, but members of SER have read through papers on general Ohio riparian forest vegetation to aid them in determining what to plant. Silver maple, sycamore, and hackberry were planted to fill the canopy. SER focused on understory species to prevent honeysuckle and Callery pear from reinvading the area. These species include native woody plants such as spicebush, redbud, blackberry, pawpaw, ninebark, persimmon, and North American hazelnut. They determined where these species should be planted in the restoration site by soil preference. A key legacy factor of the site is the presence of dogbane. Oaks and other canopy species planted in the large dogbane patch were able to establish more easily. Dogbane limits stress on saplings by decreasing deer browsing and lessening the impacts from drought.
A big goal for the restoration site is to be an educational site to help get people more involved in restoration. In addition to involving undergraduates, an important goal for SER is to involve the broader community in volunteer events such as tree planting and vegetation surveys. By being open to people with little restoration experience, the volunteer events can be valuable learning experiences to teach people in Columbus about their native ecosystems.
We're really trying to make an effort to have this be an educational opportunity, bringing as many people out here as we can to maybe survey for herbaceous stuff, or even just like plant a tree or two, learn a little bit more about nature.
Since the start of the restoration process, club members have noted improvements to the site. Herbaceous plant surveys were carried out to compare honeysuckle-dominated areas to restored areas. They found that many native plants that were not present in the honeysuckle-dominated areas had sprouted in the areas honeysuckle had been removed from, including a large number of silver maples produced through natural seeding. John says that he has noticed a substantial increase in pollinator activity at the site, although no surveys of insect populations have been done. While there have been improvements, the removal of invasives created a gap in habitat. In a paper published by the Ecological Society of America in the journal Ecosphere, Valente et al. Demonstrate that invasive removal can have short-term negative consequences for birds due to removal of structure and key habitat for birds. Leaving brush piles helped alleviate this problem by leaving behind legacy features of the invasive-dominated structure to provide habitat for wildlife and to minimize disturbance.
The goal of this restoration project is to restore the site to reference riparian conditions, but with a thicker understory to increase resilience to honeysuckle. This is a long-term goal, and it will take around 10 years until a substantial understory is established. During warm seasons, regular vegetation surveys will be conducted, and club members will continue to visit the site biweekly. Continuing to monitor the site and conduct vegetation surveys is a vital part of this restoration project so that management strategies can adapt to the successes and failures of initial plantings. With continued plantings and invasive removals that adapt based on previous experiences, the site can get closer to its natural range of variation. In both the short and long term, the site is intended to be an educational opportunity. SER hopes to continue educating the public and hosting tree planting events. Another goal is to start removing other invasives such as lesser celandine in the spring and start seeding for herbaceous plants.
And then tentative plans right now for the spring are to do some manipulation trials for lesser celandine removal. It's a kind of like weird invasive. It only pops up for a short period of time in the spring, but basically the site is carpeted with it completely. So before we start doing like any large-scale removals of it, we figured it'd be a good opportunity to do some trials. Maybe one thing that we've been talking about is just removing it from a few patches and seeing how quickly it recolonizes the area.
Throughout the restoration process, not everything went as planned. Columbus experienced a very dry summer in 2019, and drought-sensitive species like silver maple and hackberry had low survivorships. Another issue comes with the site itself. It is surrounded by heavily disturbed areas, so management will always be needed to prevent invasive colonization.